This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders, today I'm honored to have Manu Kapur on the show. He has developed a theory of productive failure as it comes to learning. He's a professor of learning sciences and higher education. And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about some of his future learning initiative and what that means and how can we as leaders use some of this information to help us be better learners. Anyway, with all that being said, Manu, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, John.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background, how you got into learning science and what is learning science, and why you focus so much on failure.
Yeah, so I mean, when I was in my teenage years, if you'd asked me if I'd be an academic or a professor, I would have laughed at you. So, it's been a meandering path. I wanted to be a soccer player, and then that didn't work out because of an injury. Plan B was engineering. I finished that up, but not wanting to continue there. Then after a few other, stints in the startup world and industry, I became a teacher, a math teacher to high school kids. And that I really enjoyed, but, I also noticed that no matter how clearly I could explain certain things to my students, there were still some who could not understand that, the things that I was trying to teach them very deeply. And that led me into, with some luck, a scholarship to do my PhD. And that's where I started focusing on, well, why is it that people are not able to understand concepts and ideas in a deep manner? And looking at existing research, I just had an epiphany one day that maybe the way to go about learning is not through the correct path or the correct knowledge up front, but to engage students in, safely curated failure-based activities that then prepare them to learn from, an expert later on. And over the last 20 years, I've built up whole theory and evidence base for designing for productive failure and learning from it.
Why is it that you think that we as humans tend to stay away? We fear failure. We try to stay away from it. Yet your research shows that that's something we probably should lean into and kind of move towards.
Yeah, actually, if you go back to when we were all children and how we learned, you will see that, it's all in us. We're not afraid of failure at all as children. I mean, the way we learn anything as a child, from learning how to walk, to talk, to language, to make sense of the world around us, we try, we fail, we get up and we keep trying again and again. So the idea that, we are built to fear failure is actually not true. We're actually quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Some of our steepest learning curves, the steepest learning that we have in our lives in the early years is actually built on mechanisms like productive failure. What happens, John, is that, over the course of schooling and growing up, our socialization, we get enculturated into thinking that failure is actually bad. Right? When in fact, if used in a safe and curated way, failure can be really powerful for learning. And that's what productive failure is all about. That, when you're trying to learn something new, don't take the path of least resistance. Mm-hmm. If in fact we design activities where people fail initially in a safe way, and then we can bootstrap that for learning, then you learn deeply so that when failure matters, when the stakes are high, the likelihood of failure is reduced.
So how do you plan for failure? How do you know where to set that bar? Because, I'm a firm believer that you never know how far you can go until you reach that failure point. But how do you plan for that and strategize to make sure you hit that in a safe way?
Yeah. So, life throws things at us, and we're bound to fail from time to time. And that's, failure, when it happens, it provides us with an opportunity to learn. So I want to make the distinction between that kind of failure, which naturally occurs from time to time, and we should definitely learn from it. And there's a lot of conversation around how we should embrace failure. And as you rightly pointed out, productive failure is not about that conversation. Productive failure really takes it one level up, one notch up, and said, well, if failure can be a powerful teacher or a powerful mechanism for learning when it happens, then why do we wait for it to happen? Why do we deliberately, intentionally design for it? And I think that's the science and design behind productive failure. So how do we do it?
Yeah.
Now, suppose you're trying to learn something new, John, and I give you a task, and you're able to do that task successfully. Yeah, that's great. Your performance is, you perform well, or you perform well, but really you haven't learned anything. Now, say I give you a much harder task, and say you're able to do that too. So, all right, you really know, you have a lot of knowledge and skills, and you're able to do an even harder task. To get you to enter the learning zone, what I call, is for me to, find out the limits of what you know. And therefore, I need to design a task or an activity or a project or a problem where you're not able to solve it with your current knowledge and capabilities. And that's the information, that's the boundary that I know when I reach, I know you're going to enter the failure zone. But the failure zone is really the zone of learning, because that by definition is the space where, you do not have the knowledge and skill sets to do things successfully, but with some support, with some mentoring, with an expert alongside, you can actually learn deeply. And that's how we design productive failure.
So a lot of times people get, emotional when they fail, especially when, the stakes matter, or when they think that they matter, but sometimes maybe they don't, because they're early on. I can think back, like early on in my career when I would be running a project and it didn't go the way we wanted it to go. It was hard for me at that time to step back and think about, how can I learn from this? And, and not just dwell on the fact that I didn't succeed. How do we kind of separate back and reflect back on those things so that we can learn after a failure occurs?
Yeah. So I think when you take on new tasks and projects such as the one that you described, chances are, the expectations were that you do the project successfully, but also because it was a challenging thing, you were also put in the failure zone yourself. Like you had to struggle, you had to, you probably had to think about quite carefully and how do you want to go about doing that project. So you were put in that, what I call is the learning zone. And oftentimes at work especially, we conflate the learning zone with the performance zone. So if you're learning something new, you want to give that challenging task which is beyond your capability. In the performance zone, well, you have the capability and you can apply it to get the stuff done, right? And if you conflate the two, that's where people get a little confused. To grow, you need that learning zone task, and to also sort of do well, you need a performance zone task. So as leaders or as team managers, when we are, working with our teams and employees, I think it is very, just to answer that question, John, it's very important that we have this conversation that, look, I am going to give you a challenge that is in your learning zone, and I know performance is also key. I expect you to struggle. You may not even be able to solve this correctly or do this successfully or optimally, but I'm here to support your growth and development. These are the kinds of conversations, unfortunately, I don't know what happened in your case, but these are the kinds of explicit conversations that do not happen in learning and workplace situations, which is why people tend to put everything in the performance zone and say, I have to succeed at this. And if I fail, it's really bad. When in fact, if you went in knowing that, okay, this is going to be challenging, I have support, people understand that I may not be able to do this entirely successfully, but then I will learn and grow and I'll do my best. That's a very different orientation you go into while taking on such challenging projects. So the idea about emotions is that they have to be the set of norms and expectations going into such challenges have to be very carefully and explicitly set out so that, employees and our team members or anybody at any stage, as they're taking on challenging tasks, they know that these are designed for them to both learn and grow as well as perform well.
Yeah. So when it comes to, failure and productive failure, how does that relate to the Future of Learning initiative that you've been working with?
So the Future Learning Initiative is really, something that we want to investigate. We want to look at It has basically two goals. A, can we do the science of human learning across multiple levels? So when you're trying to learn something new, what happens to you physiologically? What happens to you in terms of your brain behavior, your neural signatures? What happens to you cognitively? What happens to your affect, your emotions, and so on and so forth? What happens to you socially and your interaction, and so on and so forth? The first part of one major goal of the Future Learning Initiative is to understand the science of how we come to learn new things. The second part of the Future Learning Initiative is simply to take those understandings and build interventions and applications, whether it's in schools or universities or workplaces, to take those understandings and build interventions to design for deep learning in those contexts. And across these contexts, we've found that whenever we've designed an intervention where people are trying to learn something new, if you design using productive failure principles, the learning is a lot deeper and it transfers to novel situations much better. So people are more innovative, more creative, while learning more deeply. And so that's the idea behind the Future Learning Initiative.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I love the fact that you're taking the, the science of what happens, socially, physiologically, and all the different elements that revolve around a human while they're learning, and can apply that. I remember there was a book that I read many years ago called Spark that talked about, the brain state after like physical activity and how you learn based off of some of that, and just taking like small pieces of that and applying that in my life has been helpful. What have you guys learned so far when it comes to, what's going on with the body and the mind whenever, someone's in the state of learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most, and there are four kind of big umbrella mechanisms or principles that, we've learned, scientific, laws. One big thing that happens to your body when you're trying to learn something new is what I call activation. Your physiological system gets activated, your neural system gets activated, your cognitive system gets activated. And activation is key because it prepares you, it sets the groundwork. It's like you're sowing the seeds, you're preparing the land before you sow the seeds, right? To borrow the farming analogy. That's what activation is. It gets the body in that state where it's ready to receive new information, both physiologically, from an arousal standpoint, neurally, from a brain behavior standpoint, and cognitively, from your knowledge standpoint. So everything the relevant knowledge is activated. And the principle that does this activation really well is failure. So if I give you a problem to solve, and it's a challenging problem, you get aroused by it. Your emotions are charged. Your brain is firing, and you're trying different ideas to solve the problem. Even if you never get to the solution of the problem, imagine your whole system is really activated very well. And if now after this, and a teacher or an expert or a mentor comes in and sort of, works with you to help you solve the problem together, because expert knowledge is important to learn new things, that's when it all kind of comes together and for you to learn. So activation is one key thing that happens to you. Another thing that happens to you at the same time because of activation is you build an awareness that, here is what I know, and here's what I don't. So there's an awareness of a gap. And when you really, understand that there is, when you really, sense that there is an awareness of a gap, as human beings, our natural inclination is to close that gap, to bridge that gap. And that brings us this whole entire set of affects. Your motivation, your interest increases, Your engagement with the material increases. Your emotions, both positive and negative emotions. So, the idea that you're struggling and not feeling good in this initial space is actually been shown to be positive for learning. I say that again. Some negative emotions that you feel during the problem-solving process, even if you were not able to solve the problem or the project successfully or optimally, is actually good for deep learning. Not too much so that you give up, but a certain amount has been good. So, making learning easy, or learning should not always be fun and happy. A certain amount of struggle, a certain amount of feeling negative emotions can be positive for learning. And so activation, awareness, and affect, they just set you up quite nicely for then the expert to come in, assemble it all for you together with you. And that's what makes the initial struggle, the initial emotions, the initial activation, the initial failure into something that is productive.
No, I think that's really good. You have the activation, the awareness, the affect, and then the assemble. So it all comes together.
Right.
So
I call them the 4 A's of learning.
The 4 A's of learning. I love it. So when you first started going through deep learning, what's the difference between like deep learning and just something that you kind of pick up along the way?
So, there's a distinction we make in human learning. There's some things you learn, suppose, where just from an analogy standpoint, there's shallow and deep. So shallow learning means, you understand the material somewhat. You can you can solve problems or tasks that are very close to the training tasks. So, you train on something and then you apply that training to tasks that are very similar to what you trained on. So if you learn algebra problems, then a similar sets of algebra problems you're able to do quite easily. If you learned kinematics in physics, then similar sets of physics problems you can do easily. So that's kind of shallow knowledge. But deep knowledge is, do you really understand, the conceptual basis of that thing? So if I change the problem slightly, or if I ask you to ask you to explain why things are the way they are, why the concept is formulated the way they are, why this theory is formulated the way it is, you're actually able to explain that. You're actually able to solve problems that target those deep critical features. Another part of this deep understanding is that your ability to transfer, which is really the main thing that we want to have, is to take what we learn and use it creatively in new contexts. After all, that's the goal of education and learning.
Right.
If all you can do is, solve problems or apply on similar or familiar contexts as you learned, then that's not very deep learning, because that's just boxed in. What you want to be able to do is transfer to novel situations, novel contexts, and more advanced contexts. And that is what productive failure promotes. It's deep understanding in a way that's flexible, that you can transfer to novel contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I teach part-time. I'm an adjunct professor at Winthrop University in South Carolina. And how can I apply some of these things to my students and to make sure that I am, helping them learn the best that they can?
Give me like a concept or an idea that you want teachers. Yeah.
So one of the things that I try to teach my students is, in computer science, which is the field that I teach in, learning a language is not necessarily like the best thing. It's good now, but by the time they graduate, a lot of the things that they've learned is, obsolete at this point. So I want to teach them how to learn and how to continue moving their career through the lens of technology.
Yeah. So I think, yeah. So, I mean, you want to teach them some kind of meta skill or learning.
Yeah.
Learning how to learn. Yeah. And again, they're using productive failure is particularly handy. So suppose you're trying to teach, I'm just going to go think off the cuff here. Suppose you want to teach some sorting algorithms to your students or something like that.
Yes.
It's not really about the language, right? It's you give them a task where you need to sort, and you really get students to first invent their own sorting strategies, and tell them you've got to invent 3 to 5 different ways of sorting this array or something like that.
Mhm.
And don't worry if they're not the most optimal ways of doing it. I will tell you some of the canonical or major ways of doing it. But first, I want you to be able to invent or generate ideas for how you might go about sorting it. And I would even go as far as to say you don't even have to think about programming it. Just give me this logic of these sorting tasks. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think many computer science teachers I know already do this intuitively. Perhaps you do that too. And I think once students have done that, once students have, it can take maybe 20, 30 minutes to explore the space of sorting initially. And then you come in and, work with their strategies to show what works, how it works. Maybe some parts of it work, and, combine that with the more optimal ways of sorting, and then teaching them the set of strategies that you want to teach them. So, and we have actually done this in computer science classrooms.
Yeah. I think that's good. I love the fact that you're having them create something that really can go get off the shelf. You can get a sorting algorithm anywhere, but having them build one from scratch, then they're going to find some of the pitfalls. They're going to hit some challenges and some roadblocks, and be able to kind of learn from those failures. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, they will not be able to learn from those failures, because if you are a novice and you're trying to invent something new, first of all, it's good that if the teacher tells you that, look, this is normal, I don't expect you to be able to solve for it completely. But at the same time, sometimes that's the role of the expert, that once the students have tried, a few different ways of trying to solve the problem, that's when you come in and work with them to help them see why their strategies did not work. What was the critical aspect? What is the critical difference between some component of their strategy versus your correct strategy or your correct sets of strategies, right?
Yeah.
I think these contrasts are the ones that have to be drawn out very explicitly for them to be able to see. Otherwise, failure remains failure. It doesn't become productive. That's the role of the teacher, to make the failure productive. Students themselves sometimes aren't able to do that.
So a big part of it is to figure out the why things didn't work and learn from those things so that you don't repeat them in the future.
Exactly. Yeah. And contrast them with things that do work, because it is in this contrast that real learning happens. Yeah.
Okay. So after you've given them a task that's probably going to fail, let them fail, figure out the why things didn't work and contrast them with things that do work.
Exactly. Because that's when they start to see what is the critical aspect and not just the shallow aspect.
Yes.
And is that understanding the deep feature, the critical features of the sorting algorithm or the concept that you're trying to learn. That's what leads to deep knowledge, right?
That's
better.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that's an easy thing that I can start implementing in the classroom as well to help students learn. And I'm guessing as leaders in the business world, we can use this as well. With our team, as far as especially like with junior employees, if we want them to come up to speed quickly, we can give them projects that are difficult and help them see what things worked, what things didn't work through reflection, and contrast them with other projects that did go better.
Yeah, I mean, for leaders and teams, and I normally suggest 3 different ways of thinking about failure. One is failure as a learning mechanism. So the idea, if you're not using productive failure for the development of your teams and employees, then you're under-determining what they can do. You're under-determining how innovative they can be. And part of it, as you mentioned, is to design these challenging tasks for them, but then also, as I said earlier, to have this explicit conversation about, okay, you're in the learning zone now, and a certain amount of struggle and failures is to be expected, and it's important for your growth, and I'll support it. And contrast that with the performance zone, right? These are key deliverables, buddy. You have to get them right, because you have all the knowledge and skill sets to be able to do this well. So don't mess this up. So again, having this very clear boundaries as far as it is possible, and then use failure as a mechanism for learning and growth. That's one. Second, also, you can use failure as a signal. So when I go around companies, say when they have, say, kind of innovation labs, or they really want to develop innovative projects, ask them, how many of your projects are actually succeeding? And, most often people, the managers or the leaders would say, oh, we have a number of projects, all of them are doing really, really well. And I said, well, that's not innovation. You probably have a success lab, not an innovation lab. And they look at me peculiarly and said, yeah, if you're really pushing the boundaries, if you're really pushing the envelope, chances are a fair number of your projects are going to fail. Failure is not what you go after. Failure is just a product of going for operating at the cutting edge. It's just bound to happen. And so thinking about seeking the failure signal in the portfolios that leaders design for their teams and units, I think that's a new way to think about productive failure at the workplace as well. If all your people are reporting success all the time, then that's not a terribly good thing because then you in the short term you may be fine, but in the long term, which requires adaptation and innovation and so on and so forth, and you may be shooting yourself in your foot. So thinking about the metric of in your own context, how do I look for the failure signal? How do I quantify it? How do I measure it? It becomes an important exercise and for companies and organizations. So, and the third way is just basically making failure a feature of the culture, not a bug. And because people are not going to experiment widely or innovate and go after challenging tasks if failure is not safe.
Yeah.
So, not talking about failure that comes because of incompetence or stupidity. It's failure that is a natural byproduct of going after tough things, of hard things, of pushing the envelope. That's the failure that needs to have what they call psychologically safe space to be created so that people can really go at it.
Perfect.
So failure as a mechanism, failure as a signal, and failure as a feature of your culture.
I think that is great and excellent advice, and a practical thing that we can apply today in the business world. Manu, this has been a great conversation. How can people learn more about the Future Learning Initiative and pick up a copy of your book, Productive Failure?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. I mean, I enjoyed this conversation too. And if people are interested in productive failure, of course, there are 2 TED Talks on it. So if you just Google Productive Failure TED Talk by Manu Kapur, I think you'll find both of them. You're welcome to visit my site at manukapur.com. And for the book, you can it's available on Amazon, but also the book page is very imaginatively called productivefailure.com.
Awesome. And I'll link those 2 in the show notes at geekleader.com. And again, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to. Click on their links and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.